Well, Nasratha, good evening to you all. I hope you can see me. I can't see you. But all I can see is the title page, which is self-explanatory, I hope. It's milling for 1,000 years. So within the next 60 minutes or so, I'm going to try and cram in 1,000 years of the history of milling in Wales into that relatively short slot of time. Anyway, in tonight's talk, I'm going to explore the background to milling in Wales, and I'll follow the development of mills from simple hand querns to the watermills and windmills which replaced them. The Middle Ages in particular was a period of innovation and conflict, and this was reflected in the technologies of the time, but also in the widespread opposition to manorial mills, which many in Wales saw as a means of exploiting the native population by the powerful Anglo-Norman lordships. Abbeys and monasteries played a significant part in the promotion of mills, which in turn, of course, helped to sustain their coffers. And the talk will also look at different ways in which wind and water power were utilized up to and after the Industrial Revolution. Right, well, I'm going to start off with a bit of, if you like, my background history, just something about my links to mills, just to set the scene. This is David Evans. He was my great-grandfather. He was born and raised in one of the most westerly farms in Wales, overlooking St David's Head. At quite a young age, he was apprenticed to a local carpenter, and at 22, he left home to seek work in Cardiff. We're talking now about the 1850s, 1860s. In 1860, he left, as I say, he left for Cardiff, and in 1860 he left for London from Cardiff, again to sort of seek his fortune and to try and find work. And from there he moved to Liverpool, where he actually did manage to secure some work, and he was actually offered a job as a foreman. But before taking on the job of foreman, for accepting the post, he popped back home just to tell his folks that, sorry, one and all, but I'm moving away from home. But when he was down there, whilst he was at St David's, a couple of his mates must have got round and said, "Did you know that the local windmill's up for sale by auction?" And being good friends or not, they persuaded him to put in a bid for it. So he put in a bid at a very, very low price and forgot all about it and left. The next day he heard that his offer had been successful. So he became the proud owner of a windmill in St David's. Here it is. Here we are, seated in true Victorian style outside the mill in the year 1900. In the back row, the second from the right, is my grandmother, Margaretta Evans. And that's my grandfather, slightly more aged now, perhaps the effects of milling for many years, sitting there with his wife. So that's one link. The other side of the family, then, on my mother's side, my mother's in the picture, the second from the right, next to her mother. This is John and Miriam Rees. They farmed at nearby Carnochan, again at St David's, and attached to the farm was a little watermill, which was in the little beach below the farm. The farm is on the top, if you like, top of the cliff. You can see the farmland reaches to that edge. Then it dips down into the bay at Carbudi, and he used the little mill at the bottom for producing foodstuffs for his animals and livestock. Back in the early 1980s, I decided to start researching the mills, and in particular the windmills of Wales. And 40 years later, the work still continues. And to date, I found more than 220 windmill sites in Wales. Well, as you know, Wales is, to all intents and purposes, a small, I suppose, fairly insignificant little country tucked into the back pocket of its larger neighbour, England. It appears to have very little going for it. It's largely upland in character, often wet and windy. But there are some areas of good agricultural land suitable for growing corn, and in particular wheat. There are also areas where copper ore, iron, lead, coal, and even gold were found, which made it a very attractive proposition for exploitation. The land, as you can see on the right, within the shaded area within the line is receiving more than 1.3 meters of rain per year. So it's quite wet. Something else it has is an upland heartland and a good supply of rainfall. The result being scores of rivers and hundreds of streams which radiate out from the centre. As you can see from this map, Wales is in every sense an ideal watermill country. Not a particularly accessible country either, because distances in Wales are measured not in miles or kilometres, but in time. If you ask someone how long a journey is between point A and point B, the answer will invariably come back, well, allow yourself 2 hours rather than so many miles. And someone once said that if Wales was to be flattened out, it would be bigger than England. That could be right. Historically, the country was divided up into princedoms, each with its own ruler and set of laws. They were constantly making and breaking alliances with one another, changing loyalties according to what they felt was most beneficial to them. Sometimes this even meant making pacts with neighbouring English lords, marcher lords, or even the king. 1,000 years ago, Hywel ap Cadell, known as Hywel Dda or Hywel the Good, managed to unite most of the Welsh principalities under his rule, and he was proclaimed King of Wales in the year 942 AD. And one of his most significant acts was to standardise the rule of law in Wales. And these old Welsh laws were to remain in use in many parts of Wales for nearly 500 years. Under Welsh law, certain properties were deemed to be for the use and benefit of the community at large, and mills fell into this category. In other words, there was no extra charge or toll payable to the prince for using the local mill. People living within a community had the right to use it. In most cases, the hand quern was the chief means of converting corn to flour. These are kept and used in the home. In the Old Welsh laws, the quern was cited as an example of the property that bound a man and his wife during their marriage. In the event of the irretrievable breakdown of that union, their property was to be divided up, with the man keeping the upper stone of the quern and the woman keeping the lower. The one, of course, was useless without the other. It is reckoned that it took about 2 hours to grind enough corn to produce sufficient flour or meal to feed an average family for one day. However, a degree of larger scale milling was also being practiced at this time, so that several families could be provided for from a single milling centre. And these often took the form of quern houses, where presumably larger manually or animal-operated stones were housed. This is the little hand quern at the museum at St Fagans. It's in one of the roundhouses that's been reconstructed there. And this shows you one type of small hand quern. In addition to querns, water mills are also mentioned in the old laws. The mill belonged to the community rather than to a single person. And according to the laws, this is to quote, a mill and a weir and an orchard are called the three precious things of a kindred, and there is no right to alienate them, but their fruits are shared to all those who are entitled to them. Damaging a mill was a serious offence, as one might imagine. The laws record that anyone found guilty of setting fire to a mill would be liable to a fine of 10 shillings, quite a sum in those days. We don't know what type of mills these were, but some could have been horizontal mills, with water being channeled down a chute and onto paddles set around the base of a vertical shaft, as you can see here, at the top of which turned the upper stone of a pair of millstones. I didn't have an image. This is one I've actually borrowed off the internet. But you can see the basic principle. I'm not sure if they had a large lake behind the mill as they've shown it here, but there would certainly be a stream, which is then channeled down onto the paddles around the base of the upright shaft. It may well have looked a bit more like this. This is a horizontal mill in the Orkneys. And horizontal mills like these have been recorded in Scotland, the Isle of Man, and Ireland. And when you consider that there were very close ties which existed between Ireland and Wales at that time, it seems highly probable that they were also found in Wales. Indeed, one site at Darren Llangynnyr in Powys, in the old county of Breconshire, has been proposed as a location of just such a mill. 20 years after the successful occupation of England after 1066, the Normans next turned their attention to Wales. They seized the fertile coastal plains of South Glamorgan, the Gower Peninsula, South Pembrokeshire, as well as the eastern borders with England, and established marcher lordships here. Wales was carved up between lands that were still under the control of some native rulers and others that had been appropriated by the marcher lords, the church, and monastic centres, abbeys and priories, for instance. This map shows you the areas of conflict at that time, and there's quite a marked concentration of fortifications, as you can see along the English-Welsh border, and then following the coast southwards right across into Pembrokeshire. And there we are. The bluey grey areas of the Welsh Principality as it was in the 13th century, and you can see the marcher lordships encroaching then from the east. The signing of the Statute of Rhuddlan in 1284 brought Wales under the authority of the King of England, but full unity wasn't to be achieved for almost another 300 years, and the old Welsh laws remained in use in many parts of Wales right up until the Act of Union with England in 1536. And unlike the old Welsh system where buildings of common interest, like mills, could be owned by the community at large, under the Norman manorial system, ultimate control was vested in the lord of the manor. Mills provided one of the most important and effective means available to these feudal lords to control the population at large. Everyone living within a manor was obliged to grind all the corn that was to be consumed within the manor at the lord's mill, for the privilege of which they had to pay a toll or a proportion of grain by volume. And this is the famous illustration from the literal Psalter of about the year 1330. It shows a little timber-framed watermill with a stream or a leat behind it. You can actually see some traps, eel traps set into the water course as well. So we've mentioned querns, we've mentioned the fact that you had water mills which had millstones. Question then is, well, how does a millstone work? Well, milling using a quern or a mill generally involved using two circular disc-like stones, one on top of the other. The bottom stone or the bedstone was stationary, whereas the top stone could rotate above it. The top surface of the bedstone had a series of grooves cut into it, and the bottom surface of the runner stone above it had a corresponding set of patterns, but cut in the opposite direction. Thus, when the top stone rotated, the grooves created a scissor-like action. When grain was fed into the center or eye of the runner stone, the rotating scissor action of the stones caused the grain to move outwards towards the edge of the stones. As it traveled, it was progressively reduced in size until it emerged as fine meal or flour ready for bagging. And you can see this in the shot of the bedstone at Charlecote Mill. At the center with the grain lands, the grain is quite large. As it works its way outwards, you can see it getting progressively smaller and finer until by the time it reaches the edges of the edge of the stone, it's you've got your flour. As with houses and other buildings, the availability of building materials governed the building tradition in the area in question. Thus, we find in the survey of the lands and properties belonging to the Bishop of St David's, compiled in 1326, references to widely differing methods of erecting mills in West and Mid Wales. For instance, at Newton in Pembrokeshire, the walls are built of, to quote, stone or clay, whilst at Lamphy in South Pembrokeshire, the mill had mud walls and was thatched. At Castle Morris in Pembrokeshire, not that far from Newton, the structure was timber framed and wattled, as probably was the mill at Llywhaden, where the materials were brought from the nearby Forest of Loedarth. And whereas thatch was commonly used on houses and mills at this date, the watermead at Llanddew in Breconshire was tiled. In North Wales, the mill at Cemmaes was said to be built of stone and timber. William Marley, who's the prior of Abergavenny, leased out a mill, which is known as Prior's Mill, in Monk Street. The agreement stipulated there that he and his servants should have their own corn milled free of toll. And William, the abbot of Whitland, agreed to keep the mill building in good repair, but the tenant was responsible for the upkeep of the millstones and the spindle, for which he paid a rent of 22 bushels of oatmeal. And of course, larger population centres often boasted larger mills. And this fine example stood at Rhuthun and probably served the castle. The original structure is the lower level of the building. You can see a stringer course just above the doorways, extending right across the front of the building, and you can see the pattern reflected in the gable end as well. So that's the original size and shape of the building, and the upper story was added a few centuries later. So in addition to corn milling, water power is also increasingly utilized for non-milling purposes. Sheep farming and the production of wool became increasingly important during the Middle Ages. Monastic houses, especially those of the Cistercians, were at the forefront of the wool industry. And the process of turning fleece to fabric evolved into 9 different processes, all of which had to be carried out by hand, often in or near the home. And this is time-consuming and labor-intensive. One of the most critical of these stages was that of fulling, to eliminate oil, dirt, and other impurities, and to compact the woven threads in a cloth, resulting in a thickening of the fabric. The first water-powered fulling mills were recorded in Normandy as early as 1086, but the technology doesn't appear to have arrived in Britain until the 14th century. And this is a distribution map. As you can see, there are quite a few fulling mills, mainly in the southern part of Wales, and relatively few in the upland areas where perhaps we might expect to find them, and where in fact we did find them later on. Fulling stocks comprising of a pair of very heavy wooden mallets were operated alternately by cams or by a tappet wheel attached to the axle of a water wheel. As the wheel rotated, it lifted each hammer in turn, causing it to drop down with considerable force onto the cloth in a trough below. This is an animation showing exactly how the fulling stocks worked. I'm very grateful to John Brandrick for this image. It's really effective and shows exactly how these quite simple machines operated. W.H. House, in his book entitled Radnorshire, which was published in 1949, claimed that in the 14th century, almost every community in Radnorshire had its fulling and its corn mill. But that wasn't reflected in the map we saw just now. So perhaps he knows something that the author of the map didn't know. Ownership of a fulling mill, like a corn mill, was much prized and was to prove a lucrative asset for the manorial lordships. By the end of the Middle Ages, most monastic centres, and in particular those of the Cistercians, were receiving significant income from farming out mills. Whitland Abbey, Whitland Abbey had 9 corn mills and 3 fulling mills. The Benedictine Priory at Brecon received £5 from property in Brecon and £15 from leasing out 4 corn mills and 1 fulling mill. And Abbey Cumhir owned 4 mills, 3 corn mills and 1 fulling mill. This is the ruins of a former fulling mill at Milton in South Pembrokeshire. And the widespread adoption of these technologies were the first steps, really, towards what would in time become the Industrial Revolution. And in addition to milling corn and fulling cloth, mills were also used to pump water out of mill workings, used for paper making, sawing timber, essentially virtually anything that required some form of motive power. However, there were some parts of the country that were drier, often limestone areas that were not always suited to water-powered mills. And the answer was the windmill. It's believed that the windmill was invented, quote, somewhere in England during the middle to latter part of the 12th century, and that from here it spread to other parts of Norman England, to Flanders, and then to Normandy. It took nearly 50 years before they appeared in Wales. So why did it take so long for them to arrive in Wales? Well, the truth is that it was the Anglo-Normans who were not welcome in Wales and not the windmills. The earliest windmill site that's been discovered in Wales would you believe, not all that far from the Rudnashire border. It was here at Montgomery. In 1223, King Henry III had ordered the erection of a new castle at Montgomery as a defence against the incursions by the Welsh under their leader Llywelyn ap Iorwerth. 10 years later, in September 1233, Henry staged 2 nights at Montgomery, during which time he issued several patents, one of which reads, "Grant to Robert the Mason and his heirs of the King's Windmill of Montgomery." These early windmills were quite simple timber-framed boxes balanced on top of a massive braced oak post, as you can see in this mid-14th century illustration. They had a simple pitched roof which would have been thatched or covered with split wooden shingles to provide a waterproof covering. The walls were probably being covered with timber boards, which would have been nailed to the timber frame. And a long tail pole which extended down from the back of the mill to the ground enabled the miller or his assistant to rotate the mill so that the sails faced into the wind. And I'm again grateful to John Brandrick for this excellent cutaway drawing, showing how such a mill may well have appeared. You can see there's a doorway at the back. The doorway, of course, had to be wide enough to accommodate a miller carrying a sack. Inside the mill was quite cramped, with room for only a single pair of millstones. Before grinding, the grain in the sack was measured using a wooden measure or dish, and then a proportion of the grain was set aside by the miller as a payment or toll for milling the grain. So that's your typical early medieval post-mill. Medieval depictions of Saint Christopher often include scenes associated with his legend, and these include a hermit, sometimes holding a lamp, and Christopher himself bearing the Christ child upon his shoulder as he crosses a river or a raging torrent, sometimes complete with fish. I think there's only one fish in this image. Also included were scenes from the countryside, which people would have been familiar with. And this mid-15th century woodcut includes on the bottom left, as you can see, a little watermill and a miller. But we have one example in Wales. And here it is. This is A similar scene painted onto the wall of St. Cyran's Church in Llananis in Denbigh. It was painted during the late 15th century. It shows the same subjects, but this time, look at the bottom on the left-hand side, we have a windmill instead of a watermill. The second reference to windmill in Wales is at Llanilltyd Fawr or Llantwit Major in the year 1262. At some point between 1262 and 1280, when Gilbert de Clare was Earl of Glamorgan, the Welsh launched one of their fiercest attacks on Llantrisant. The castle survived, but nearly 100 houses were put to the torch and destroyed, as was the windmill, which stood near the town. By 1295, Gilbert de Clare could boast that he had 3 watermills and 1 windmill at Llanblethian, and the first windmill to be recorded in North Wales was built in the year 1303 in Newborough. In the year 1316, John Gifford, who was warden of the Earl's lands and castles in Glamorgan, recorded the loss of income resulting from Welsh attacks. Mills presented a particularly attractive target and was seldom spared. At Rumney, to the east of Cardiff, 2 watermills and a windmill were damaged. This is the distribution of medieval windmills. You can see that they follow certainly along the southern coast and along the eastern border. They follow the march of lordships. And you can see along the top then where the English under Edward II started to make incursions along the North Wales coast. They started to appear in Carnarvonshire and Anglesey. We don't know how many mills there were in existence during the Middle Ages, but it's reckoned that there were at least 20 corn mills operating in Radnorshire at this time. We also know of 68 medieval mills in Anglesey, including 6 windmills, 2 of which belonged to the Cistercian Abbey of Aberconwy. In fact, most monastic houses owned mills. They were needed to provide flour for the abbey or priory, part of whose remit was to provide shelter and food for weary travellers or those in need. And such centres were also able to invest in the latest technologies of the time, and when windmills appeared in the scene, they quickly commissioned their own. Neath Abbey owned a windmill at Monk Nash, whilst Margam Abbey had a windmill near Kenfig. The Cistercian Abbey of Basingstoke also had a windmill in Holywell. The Bishop of St David's had a windmill near one of his palaces at Lamphey, and the Bishop of Bangor had a windmill at Gogarth, near Llandudno. Medieval windmills, as you can see from this map, were found as far afield as Tenby and Castlemartin in the southwest, to Anglesey in the north and east towards the English border. 2 major events during the second half of the 14th century and into the early decades of the 15th were to have a big impact on life in Wales. The first was the arrival of the Black Death in early 1349. It's reckoned that about a third of the population of about 300,000 died of the pestilence in Wales. And this wall painting in Llancarvan Church shows a fashionably dressed young man being dragged away towards the graveyard by the figure depicting death on the right. The message of the wall painting was to stress the fragile nature of life. No matter how well off you were in material terms, death comes to us all. And this was, of course, a particularly poignant message when it was set against the effects of the plague. The effects of the plague were felt throughout the country, and properties and mills became neglected and ruined. There was a shortage of people to farm the land and a shortage of millers to grind the grain. Some of those who survived the plague were able to take advantage of the new situation and were able to acquire lands at much reduced rents. Many of the Marcher lordships had been weakened, and this must have encouraged and emboldened some of the Welsh leaders who now saw an opportunity to reassert their influence within the country. Matters came to a head in the year 1400 when Owain Glyndwr set out on a systematic campaign to establish the independence of Wales. Within 5 years, he controlled most of the country and had pushed the eastern boundary well into England. Mills were an obvious target. Disabling a mill meant that flour could not be produced, and this in turn presented an effective and instant means of disrupting not only the food supply, but also manorial control over the population. Although initially successful, Glyndwr's forces could not match the overwhelming superiority of the English armies, and by the year 1412 the uprising was effectively over. But the effects of the rebellion on the manorial system were considerable and long-lasting. The minister's accounts for the manor of Llantwit in the year 1492 illustrate this point. To quote, "For the windmill, nothing, because no one would take it on account of want of repairs." Another example, this time from the minister's accounts for Castle Martin in the earldom of Pembroke, reads, "The windmill there is said to be of no value because it was burnt in the time of the Welsh rebellion and has not yet been rebuilt." Henry VIII's decision to close down the monasteries and seize their assets led to an opportunity for some people to buy lands and estates. They took over the roles of lords of the manor, could now extract tolls and payments from their customers. And when new mills were erected, these were often better built and with a greater emphasis and with a greater milling capacity than the predecessors. This timber-framed mill at Rosset was built in the year 1588, but replaced an earlier one of 1544. Tidal power was also utilised in some areas. The earliest recorded tidal mill in Anglesey was at Treorgorf, which was certainly in existence by 1524. In Carew, in South Pembrokeshire, there was a mill certainly here by 1542, and another Llandisylio on the Menai Straits was built in 1576. When the time came to build new windmills, they turned their backs on the old timber post mills by and large, and they built them as stone tower mills. These were more expensive than the old timber post mills, but stronger and resilient. And now it was only necessary to turn the cap to turn into the wind rather than the whole structure. Got two examples here, both from Glamorgan, one from Newton Down and one at Wick. And this is a recreation, again by John, of an early tower mill to show how it might have looked at that time. And many thanks to John for these excellent drawings. However, it still is possible that at least some new post mills were built. This could be one of them. This is shown in a map of the Llanddyfnan estate in Anglesey, which was surveyed in the year 1748. The mill was actually demolished the following year and replaced by a large stone-built tower mill. Wool continued to play an important part in the rural economy, and more pandai or fulling mills were built to meet the growing demands for woolen fabrics. There's a real rash of black dots this time, showing the spread of fulling mills right across Wales. I'm sure there are more to be added to this map, and if you know of any, do get in touch with somebody in the Welsh Mill Society. We'd be more than happy to hear from you. Of course, using a windmill or a water wheel or two didn't in itself make a process industrial, which raises the question, at what point does a craft trade become industrialized? And where did the industry first become established in Wales? Well, the answer to the latter, it has been suggested, was Tintern in Monmouthshire. Iron smelting had already been established here by the mid-16th century, and by the 1560s, a wire works, the first in Britain, was opened here. It was also the first place where brass was produced in 1568, as recorded on this plaque. By the 1600s, the area around Tintern was the largest industrial complex in Wales. employing several hundred people. Water from the river Angidi, a tributary of the River Wye, was the main source of power. There was a furnace where a water wheel powered bellows which created the blast into the furnace chamber to burn the charcoal and melt the iron ore. The largest building had 4 water wheels, which were used to power the machinery and rollers that were necessary to convert the metal to wire. At its peak, there were 22 water-wheels using the Angidi River to power the furnaces, forges, and wireworks. And other tributaries of the Wye also powered things like a paper mill at Whitebrook, copper and tinplate works at Redbrook, and another wireworks at Lydbrook. And this happened at a time when the population was growing rapidly, and many young people, especially men, were unable to find employment on the land. Coincidentally, this is also the time when production of copper, lead, iron, zinc, copper, lead, zinc, iron, coal, and slate were expanding at a dramatic rate. Industries which were desperate for manpower to mine the ores and to operate the furnaces, forges, and mills. People were drawn in their tens of thousands to the coal mining valleys of South and East Wales and to the slate quarries in the north. The increasing population and growing townships led to an increased demand for food and also fabrics for clothes, which in turn gave a boost to the agricultural economy of the countryside. And farmers in turn needed cast iron machines and water wheels to produce the food for the emerging towns, which meant more work for the ironworks and foundries. And you can see on this illustration um, of the Cyfarthfa ironworks, you can see at least 2 water wheels um, alongside some of the buildings there. Again, it was water power that supplied the motive power to operate machinery in these factories and furnaces. Large water wheel in the background, and this is a cam coming off the axle, which in turn operates a drop hammer in one of the forges. Foundries were now able to produce cast iron machinery, which could be used in mills, as in this example at Hundred House Mill. Of course, prior to this, to the arrival of cast iron, everything had to be made from timber. Cast iron was of course much more resilient and much more flexible and enabled more complex gearing to be employed within water mills. The cast iron water wheel at Llancarvan Mill. And if you want more than one, there's one. This is mill in Cochwillan, which had 2 water wheels in tandem. Again, the rims being made of cast iron. But to return to windmills for a moment, after about the year 1750, the early stone mills, housing just a single pair of millstones, were replaced by much larger and taller tower mills, and 3 quite distinct regional types evolved. In West Wales, these are fairly short and squat. They could be quite primitive in appearance, as you can see from the example, especially with the St David's windmill and Tenby on the bottom right. In Mid Wales and North Wales, especially in Anglesey, they were slightly taller, but more slender in appearance. You can see the very obvious taper to the shape of the towers. These are 2 examples, both in Anglesey. This is Melin Cemais on the left, Melin Afa Amrwch on the right. And in South and Southeast Wales, much taller windmill towers, usually with a gallery about halfway around the tower. Because the sails were that much higher up off the ground and they had to be tended to by the miller, hence the reason for the gallery. The one on the top right, you can just see Melin D and Wick. You can just see the supports for the gallery still surviving in that photo. I think I took that back in about 1972. And these new windmills, of course, were much more technically advanced, and the use of cast iron gearing meant that they could operate 2, 3, or even 4 pairs of millstones. Radnor was one part of Wales where windmills were virtually unknown. In fact, there's only one place name that suggests the presence at one time of a windmill. This was on a hilltop site in the parish of Llanbadarn Fynydd, which bears the name Felin Wynt. Again, if anybody knows of any other windmill sites in Radnorshire, I'd be more than happy to hear from you. Unlike water wheels, windmills were also utilised for non-milling work, pumping water out of mine workings or quarries, grinding oak bark for the tanning industry, crushing pigments for use in the manufacture of paint, timber sawing, even possibly the production of snuff from tobacco near Tenby in Pembrokeshire. This is Llanygau site, a little romantic sketch, shows a 5-sailed windmill at Llanbadarn Fawr, which was used to grind oak bark for use in a nearby tannery. At Kingsland in Holyhead, the Tannereville sawmill had a windmill to operate the sawing machinery, and this is actually featured on the company's letterhead. And there's also a windmill which is used to pump water out of a gold mine in Merionethshire. The last tower mill to be built in Wales was a 5-sailed windmill that was used to pump water out of copper ore workings on Paris Mountain in Anglesey. It was built, would you believe, to assist a steam engine because the cost of transporting coal right up to the top of the Paris Mountain was quite significant, especially if on such an open, exposed location where there's plenty of wind. This is how the site looks today. It's a rather desolate, almost lunar landscape. And this is how it would have looked when the windmill still had sails. Melyn y Bont in Anglesey was unique in Wales, being a combined wind and water mill. You can see the pond. This is the mill pond behind the windmill. And the water wheel is actually in the basement level. It had 4 pairs of millstones, 3 on the second floor, which are overdriven off the crown wheel, and 1 on the third floor, which was underdriven. And these could be worked either by using the windmill sails or by using the water wheel in the basement. And if you follow the shaft down from the windmill sails, you see a large clutch, and there's one just above the water wheel at the bottom. So if you lift the clutch up, it engages with the windmill sails, and if you disengage that and drop it down to engage with the bottom part, it connects with the water wheel. Woolen mills, of course, still played an important part in the Welsh rural economy right up to the beginning of the 20th century. The largest concentration of woolen mills, certainly in West Wales, was around in the area around Drefach, Velindre, and you can see the cluster of about 45 woolen mills just down there. Here's one example. Again, the use of cast iron machinery for the water wheels, for gearing, and for the machinery inside. This is the blanket mill, the Lerry blanket mill at Talabont, Ceredigion. On the top left is the rock mills at Capel Dewi in Carmarthenshire, a wide overshot water wheel there. Again, an iron water wheel. And on the right, Esgair Moel woolen mill from Llanwrtyd, which is now at the museum at St Fagans. You have these set of fulling stocks, which once stood at Pontardawe. quickly looking at the agricultural scene. On farms, of course, meanwhile, a lot of agricultural processes were heavy and monotonous and required valuable manpower. One answer was horsepower, um, and these horse mills were quite commonly used, city for crushing cider apples in the production of cider, um, especially along the eastern borders and to southeast Wales. The potential for using water power, of course, was also realised. Um, it is used to drive a purpose-built gorse mill. At Dolwen in Denbighshire. On farms, wherever possible, water wheels were located next to the barn, in which case the power could be taken directly off the axle or off a cog from a toothed wheel attached to the side of the water wheel, as you can see here. If you look closely through the water wheel, you can see a smaller wheel just behind it with a set of um, iron teeth. And that was used to drive things like threshing machines, winnowers, and even butter churns. If a good water supply wasn't available close at hand, then the water wheel could be located some distance from the farmstead, um, as in this case at Erugell Farmers in Carmarthenshire. And in this case, the wheel is linked to the barn by means of underground shafting. Planned farmsteads were actively being promoted in places like Scotland, the northeast of England, and Norfolk, and the idea soon gained favour in Wales. These often incorporated horse mills, water mills, or windmills in their designs. This is a proposed design for such a planned farmstead dated 1833 by J.C. Loudon. And here are two Welsh examples, both in Glamorgan. These are taken off the tithe maps. One on the left is shows the newly created Hayes farm, which was laid out in the year 1813, measured 462 acres. And included in the impressive planned farmstead was a windmill, which was located just next to the barn. On the right, you've got a similar situation at Cog Farm, which is quite close by. This is Hayes Farm today, and it still retains its machinery inside. On a slightly smaller scale, you find examples of farm windmills such as this one at Gairn in Anglesey. And many rural industries also made use of water power, as of course at the Rhaeadr Tannery, which has been moved and re-erected at St. Fagans. And here are three other industrial examples. At Trelogan, the Trelogan lead mines in Flintshire, both a windmill and a steam engine, which is marked here as a fire engine, are recorded on this map of 1735, and they were used to pump water out of the lead mine workings. And built about 1755, this impressive water wheel at the Dyfi furnace in Ceredigion was used to power bellows in the blast furnace that was used for smelting iron ore. It only operated for about 50 years before being converted for use as a sawmill. And two examples of the use of water wheels in copper mines. This is Cwm Cyprwth copper mine near Cwm Pennant in North Wales. And another one, this time at the Ystrad copper mine, but instead of being above ground, this water wheel is actually below ground, by way of contrast. The growing demand for flour led to larger and larger mills. This is Donegair corn mill in Brecon. Another example, this is the old steam-powered mill at Llanstadwyl near Neyland in South Pembrokeshire. And at Carew in South Pembrokeshire, the old 16th century tidal mill was totally rebuilt in the year 1801. But as steam power and later oil became more efficient, cheaper, and more readily available, watermills and windmills increasingly became redundant. The writing was on the wall. The repeal of the Corn Laws of 1846 um, and the development of huge corn milling facilities at major ports resulted in cheap, good quality wheat flour flooding the market, and small traditional mills just could not compete. In South Wales, Joel Spiller and Samuel Brown opened their first mill at the West Dock in Cardiff in 1854. By 1885, Spiller's original mill had been replaced by three larger buildings containing rollers in place of millstones, and they were able to mill about 100,000 tons of wheat each year. And the scale of some of these mills was quite enormous. This is Joseph Rank's mill in Barry Docks. Against such competition, traditional mills just could not compete, and they turned increasingly to producing feed for animals. One by one, the mills, woolen factories, and water wheels ceased working. The legacy can still be seen on the landscape to this day. So, what of the future? The large windmill tower at Llancaio in Usk was refurbished for use as holiday accommodation. It opened as the six-bedroom holiday unit in time for the Ryder Cup, which was held at the Celtic Manor Resort, Newport, in 2010. And from a distance, it looks quite convincing, even if the sales are a little bit on the short side. And this is Blackpool Mill, which has recently been restored and has now been refurbished as a restaurant. But they've retained the vast majority of the machinery inside. So actually, if you look closely at the picture in the top right, you can see the dining tables set amongst the millstones. Even the National Trust have got in on the act and have now have restored waterwheel on display at the old tin work site at Aberthilis. And it's put to good use because it actually generates electricity as well. The old windmill in St David's, my great-grandfather's windmill, stopped working in 1904. By 1910, it had been incorporated into a new hotel. It's recently been totally refurbished and extended, and today it is a luxury art hotel. The rooms at the top of the tower having particularly panoramic views over the St David's Peninsula. Some watermills have been restored, and a few are still milling today, such as Evelyn and St Ogmills, Talgarth Mill in Powys, and Felinganol and Rhystyd. However, only one windmill has been restored to full working order in Wales, namely Melin Llynon in Anglesey. Relatively few mills survive today in Wales in anything like their original appearance. However, in their day, they certainly made their mark on the Welsh landscape, and their legacy lives on in place names and, of course, in the physical evidence on the ground still surviving in many places. They remain as proud sentinels of a way of life that time has passed by, but which also perhaps foretell a future where cleaner wind and water power sources will once again help meet the nation's food and energy needs. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.